Understanding Bible Prophecy, this is lesson number 2. Before we proceed with the lesson, we would like to do just a bit of promotion and remind you that you can subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking on the little guy down in the corner, and that will make you a part of other lessons of this series and also include you in other series that we are making available. Let's move right into the lesson. Um, the paradigm that we are following in these lessons is that Bible prophecy is similar to a puzzle with pieces that need to be assembled properly to get the big picture. And today we will be looking at the nation of Israel. Before we get into prophecy concerning Israel, we want to do a quick review of the history of Israel, and we're going to do this with an Old Testament timeline. The Old Testament begins with Genesis, where God created the heaven and the earth, the story of Noah and the flood. Also, we have the Tower of Babel. And after these great events, the story then began to focus upon just one man by the name of Abraham and his descendants, Isaac and Jacob. This puts us around 2,000 years before the time of Christ, or a little over 4,000 years ago. The descendants of Abraham ultimately found themselves in another land, the land of Egypt, and they had been promised that they would live in Canaan land. And instead, for hundreds of years, they were out of that land and slaves. And ultimately and eventually, God raised up a deliverer, and that was Moses. You're familiar with Moses and the burning bush, Moses parting the Red Sea, and the people escaping that bondage, and ultimately Joshua leading them back into the Promised Land. This is around 1400 years before Christ, and this time frame was followed by what is known as the time of the judges. These were leaders in Israel who helped them during times of difficulty. Of note were two women, Ruth and Deborah, and then there's also Gideon, Samson, and Samuel during this time frame. Then Israel became a kingdom. They had a king. The first was Saul. The second was King David. Most people are familiar with the young shepherd boy David, who became king, and ultimately his son Solomon, who became a powerful ruler. And it was he who built the first temple in Jerusalem. Eventually, the nation of Israel experienced a civil war and became two separate countries, Israel to the north, Judah to the south. This is the time of the divided monarchy. This is the period when the prophet Elijah lived. At a certain place in history, the nation of Israel was captured by the Assyrian Empire. The capital city fell at this point. The capital city was Samaria. Several years later, Judah had a similar experience during the time of Isaiah and Jeremiah. Babylon had become a powerful empire in the area, and they captured the nation of Judah, destroyed the temple that Solomon had built in Jerusalem, and this began what is known as the Babylonian exile. Prophets of note during this time are Daniel and Ezekiel. When the exile ended, the people returned back to the land. Ezra and Nehemiah are known for their leadership in rebuilding the city of Jerusalem and also rebuilding the temple that Solomon had originally built. A prophecy went forth during that time and Daniel the prophet records it in his book, and it is a prophecy of multiple Gentile empires that would rise up and rule over Israel during a long, long period of time. And this would continue until Israel actually became an independent nation once again. Overlaid on all of this, we find the New Testament and what is known as the Church Age. For the sake of clarity, I want to give you a different view of that time period of when different empires would rule over Israel. And this is a period of many, many hundreds, actually several thousand years. I'm not going to be referring to Israel and Judah as two separate nations. Just in your mind, let's think of them as Israel. Israel lost the kingdom. We find this in the book of Daniel, where he receives this vision of a statue. This statue represents empires that are going to rule upon this earth down through history from this point forward. Also, there was another prophet who was a contemporary of Daniel, also in Babylon at this time. God gave him an amazing vision, and he was taken to a valley of dry bones. It was a cemetery. It was a place of death, and he was asked by God, "Can these bones live again?" And God told him, "This is the entire house of Israel, and they will once again be restored as a nation." The time period between what Daniel saw as Gentile empires ruling over Israel and what Ezekiel saw as Israel being restored as a nation, the time period between those is called the time of the Gentiles, the time of the Gentile empires, when these Gentile empires, world empires as it were, would exercise authority over Israel. But the Bible says that in the end of days, Israel would once again become an independent nation, but it will be greatly opposed by the other nations of the world, and ultimately a ruler will arise because of this conflict and these situations, and bring about a system. And most people are familiar with the mark of the beast. That's where this takes place, and we'll be looking at these events in subsequent studies. Again, I want to remind you, we brought this point out in lesson number 1, the purpose of Old Testament prophecy. When Israel was out of the promised land during this time of the Gentiles, without an independent kingdom, God wanted them to know he had not forgotten them. And these prophecies went forth so that the people of Israel could keep hope, faith, and confidence in God's promises. Okay, let's look a little closer at this statue that was revealed to Daniel during this time of Babylonian captivity. He told King Nebuchadnezzar that the statue had a head of gold, and that Babylon, the Empire of Babylon, was this head of gold, and represented by King Nebuchadnezzar. Followed by another Gentile empire, which was the Medo-Persian Empire, and that is the section, the arms and chest of silver. Followed by yet another empire, Greece, Alexander the Great, if you're a student of history, and that is represented by brass, and then ultimately the Empire of Rome. Very, very powerful empire during that time. This was during the time Christ was born, if you remember. The Jewish people were living in the land, but under the dominion of the Romans. And then finally, a final empire, which is the feet, which are iron mixed with clay. From gold to silver to brass to iron to almost a useless mixture of iron and clay, the value of each of these metals goes downward. We're laying the image on its side to help you to better understand the time frame of other events that happen during the different phases of Gentile empire dominion on the earth. The Babylonian captivity of the Jews during the time of Daniel and Ezekiel is the same time period as the head of gold. When Jesus was born, that was during the time period of the Roman Empire and followed by the time frame of the church when Jesus Christ established the church on the earth, which fits very much during the time frame of the division of the Roman Empire and takes us all the way up to our current days, where the yet future prophetic event of the feet of iron and clay will be during a time of great tribulation on the earth. And this is also the time of the return of Christ to establish his kingdom, which is represented by a rock that hits this image in the feet and destroys the whole thing. We'll talk more about that in additional lessons. Winding up our understanding of this statue, we want to reiterate that this is empires that rule over Israel after they had been removed from the land during the Babylonian captivity, and these different types of metal in the statue represent the empires of Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and ultimately a yet future reiteration of Rome, iron mixed with clay, and also with the number 10, meaning the 10 toes of that yet future empire. This again is called the time of the Gentiles. In the book of Daniel, there is an additional prophecy concerning these empires, but it is not shown by a statue. Instead, it is shown by beasts, strange and powerful. And we can see these beasts actually represented in some of the historical imagery of these empires of Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Very much like the image that we see represented in the statues that archaeologists are able to find during this time. And the four beasts came up out of the sea, diverse one from another. The first was like a lion, had eagle's wings. And I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted from the earth, made to stand upon the feet as a man. And the man's heart was given to it. Daniel, in having this vision, apparently was able to impress the rulers so much that they took it as their national emblem. You are the head of gold, he told Nebuchadnezzar. A lion with a head of gold and wings of an eagle is Babylon. Daniel chapter 7, again reading. Behold, another beast, a second, like unto a bear, raised itself up on one side, had 3 ribs in the mouth between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. This is the Medo-Persian Empire. After this, behold, lo, another like a leopard, and this is Greece, which had on the back 4 wings of a fowl. The beast also with 4 heads, dominion was given to it. Moved swiftly like Alexander the Great, and ultimately at his death, his empire, his kingdom was divided among his 4 generals. After this I saw in the night, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful, terrible, strong exceedingly, had great iron teeth. It devoured, brake in pieces, stamped the residue with the feet of it. It was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. And this is the Roman Empire. In the statue, it's the portion of iron, and in the imagery of the beast, it has iron teeth. Moving forward to the New Testament book of Revelation, the last book in the Bible, we find these beasts once again in the prophetic imagery that Christ gave to John. And let's take a look at this in Revelation 13. I stood upon the sand of the sea. I saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads, 10 horns, upon his horns 10 crowns, upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard. His feet were as the feet of a bear, his mouth the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, his seat, his great authority. In the end days there will rise up upon this earth an empire that is going to be a composition of the lion, the bear, the leopard, the beast. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And if we look at this world map, we'll see which nations that encompasses. In Europe, North Africa, Turkey, Egypt, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Arabia, and ultimately encompass the nation of Israel. Babylon is gold. Medo-Persia is silver. Greece is the leopard. And the Roman beast. This is the area that we can expect in the end days. The Antichrist is going to exercise his fullest authority. Well, thank you very much for being a part of lesson number 2. We'll get into greater detail on these things in subsequent